This is the Before You Read lecture on material from Exodus and Leviticus that is related to the commandments, the construction of the tabernacle, and some instructions for sacrifice. Once again, the lecture and the related reading from the Bible will only give you a sense of this material, although there is much more that could be said and read about each of these topics. It is hard to overstate the significance of these topics for Israel's life together and life with God. I want to start with a discussion of the commandments and the laws that we find in Exodus chapters 19 through 24. Before getting into the specifics, there are a few things that I want to mention or highlight. First, it's important to remember the narrative context of the law giving. God gives the people the commandments and the laws after their liberation from Egypt. Laws follow redemption and salvation. This is important because we as Christians can too easily assume that the Old Testament demands legalistic religion while the New Testament offers something like a grace-based religion. But the narrative context of Exodus pushes against this. God's redemption and God's choice of Abraham and his offspring hundreds of years before are indications of God's grace. The laws follow grace. They outline how Israel can live as God's special people, but they don't provide a pathway for somehow earning God's favor. Second, scholars distinguish between two types of laws in this section of Exodus. On the one hand, there are apocalyptic laws, which are more absolute. Do or don't do this. We see these, for example, in the Ten Commandments. On the other hand, there are caustic laws. They often have the structure of, if X happens, then Y should happen in response. We see these especially in chapters 21 through 24. Third, and finally, it is important to try to discern what sort of community or social arrangement is imagined by the different laws. While the narrative indicates that these laws were given to a bunch of disparate tribes wandering through the wilderness, many of the laws reflect a far more stable and even maybe an agrarian society. This is another place where the biblical texts suggest two horizons: the narrative horizon of the story and the historical horizon of when the story was written and or edited. In Exodus 19 through 20, we read of the giving and reception of the law. The material leading up to the giving of the law is what scholars describe as a cultic character. Whatever else this material does, it shows the reader how to behave in the presence of the divine, or even how to prepare to enter into the presence of the divine. The material in chapter 19 is also described as a theophany, a technical term used to describe the appearance of God in the human realm. Notice the sorts of physical phenomena that accompany God's presence. Imagine the sorts of emotions that these phenomena would evoke in the characters in the narrative. And think about what they tell us about God's nature. In Exodus 20, we finally get the Ten Commandments. There are similar accounts in Deuteronomy 5, Leviticus 19, and Deuteronomy 22. We often refer to these laws as the Decalogue, which from the Latin literally means 10 words. And we see this reference to 10 words, for example, in Exodus 34:28, Deuteronomy 4:13, and Deuteronomy 10:4. These 10 words are sort of foundational to Israelite religious and ethical practice. There are a variety of ways to group these 10 commandments or 10 words. There's a Jewish tradition of breaking them up into 5 positive commands, do this, and 5 negative commands, don't do this. Christians have tended to distinguish commands related to God and those related to neighbor. In this scheme, the first 4 outline Israel's obligation to Yahweh. Don't worship other gods, don't make idols, don't misuse the divine name, and observe the Sabbath. The remaining 6 outline proper relations in human society. Honor your parents, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, tell the truth, and don't covet. When it comes to the Ten Commandments, the rest of the Old Testament gives ample evidence that Israel struggled to actually abide by these commandments, both in terms of their relationship to God and their relationship to their neighbors. As you read, think about the degree to which these laws are realistic, or are they more ideals or even utopian? Given the prominent place of the Ten Commandments and that they've played in recent political debates in our country, how universal are they? Or are they more fitting for a particular social and economic situation? Exodus 21 through 24 is often described as the Book of the Covenant. This section contains a number of laws and stipulations related to human society, all reflecting what it means for Israel to be in covenant with Yahweh, a special legal and religious relationship with God. My guess is, though, that some of these instructions may be surprising or even troubling. Exodus 21, for example, gives instructions for buying Hebrew slaves and for the proper treatment of slaves, while Israel's redemption from slavery itself is just barely in the background. There are also a lot of instructions related to consequences of various forms of violence. You may be bothered by how many times death is offered as the appropriate or fitting consequence to another action. What are we to make of these? I think one strategy is to think about how the laws are intended to actually moderate or limit retaliation or violence. Again, we're thinking of Israel as a group of loosely affiliated tribes at this point. While some of the commandments may seem severe to us, many were intended to limit the escalation of violence and retaliation. In Exodus 25 through 28, we read about the divine intentions for the tabernacle. In important ways, the tabernacle anticipates the construction of the temple hundreds of years later. It is, in effect, a transportable temple. The tabernacle provides a place and space for Israel to interact with God during their wilderness wanderings. As you read this material, you might get lost in the details, specifications about height and length, instruction about what types of materials to use, and so forth. That's a lot to keep track of. But try to keep in mind what these chapters say about what it takes to prepare to meet God. How do the details related to the tabernacle reflect these preparations? And how does the narrative draw on your own imagination? Can you see the tabernacle being built? Does it draw on any of your other senses? With Leviticus 16 through 17, we turn for the first time to the book of Leviticus. We will be spending more time in this book of the Bible later in the course, so I'll save some of my comments for a future lecture. Chapter 16 outlines the Day of Atonement, one of the more important rituals in Leviticus. I'm guessing, and I've found in the past, that many Christians find the idea of sacrifice a little off-putting. We tend to think of this as an elementary or primitive form of worship, or worse, we associate it with a God who can only be satisfied with blood or death. As you read, I invite you to put these thoughts on hold for a bit and see if you can understand the logic of sacrifice for Leviticus 16 and 17. What does it do and why is it necessary? Earlier in this lecture, I've already given you some questions to consider related to each of these three topics. I hope that you'll take time to think through them as you read. In addition to those questions, I would remind you again to pay attention to what's happening inside of you as you read. To what elements of the text are you drawn? What elements repel you? How does the understanding of God and community in the text differ from your own understanding? Lots to consider and lots to discuss. But for now, get reading.